Back in 2003, I was speaking at the Gallup building in Washington, D.C., and there were a lot of big dignitaries on the program. Dr. Martin Seligman, who was the president of the American Psychological Association, of course, author of a lot of really famous books. And we had Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who, of course, created the concept of flow and was a professor at Berkeley, and lots of really big dignitaries. And one of them was a gentleman named Vint Cerf. Vint Cerf. Now, if you've never heard that name, it's probably because he is very low-key. Today, he works for Google, and he's a consultant, I believe, with Google, and he's got some very high-level, very high-level position there. But back then, he was speaking about the internet because he's known as one of the fathers of the internet. He's the gentleman that headed up the team that invented email, if you can imagine. So we were on the program together, and he spoke, and they introduced him as the father of the internet. And his speech was great, and he was a super, super humble speaker, which sometimes is hard to find when you're on a speaking tour. You speak with a lot of big egos and that type of thing. And so anyway, I saw him backstage, and there was a big food set up backstage for the speakers at lunch. And so I was next to him in the food line. I introduced myself, and I was speaking later that day. And I said, I really enjoyed your speech. Is there a way we could sit and have lunch? And he said, sure. And so we sat down, and I said, the first thing I want to ask you is, people always talk about, especially speakers and authors and, thought leaders talk about, changing the world. I said, well, you actually changed the world. Did you set out to change the world through the internet or through email? And he said, no, I didn't. And I said, well, what led to you inventing email? He said, well, I was working for MCI in 1968, and they wanted a better way to communicate within the offices. So we created this system. We didn't call it email. We called it packets. And so we created a system where people on their computers could send information, email we'd call it now, little packets of information to each other. And that was the whole thing. I said, so you didn't see the whole email thing exploding around the world like it has? And he said, not at all. He said, but MCI paid for it. And that was the inception of email. And then he went on to develop the structure of the internet, if you can imagine. And he was fascinating to have lunch with. We sat there and talked for about an hour. And I think the thing I really wanted to pass on about him to people that are speakers and people that want to be professional speakers, paid speakers, that type of thing, professionals that want to go into speaking either to grow their practice or their business, which is a very, very smart thing to do. The thing I learned from Vint Cerf probably more than anything else, obviously the story of the internet and email was just fascinating. You're getting it first person from the guy that invented email, and was he denies, like he says, well, I'm not really the father of the internet. And he jokingly said Al Gore is the father of the internet. That was kind of a joke. But we did talk about Al Gore. If you remember that story, Al Gore, they were sort of calling him the father of the internet. He kind of called himself that many years ago, if you don't remember. But Vint Cerf said, well, he didn't really say that. What he really did was he funded it. He funded the project. He said, so in a way, he was one of the fathers of the internet. So he goes, he really was technically correct. He said, but I was just one of the people, although he was one of the main people from what everyone says, and which is probably why he's one of the biggest consultants that Google has. Now, the thing I learned from him really as a speaker, though, that was in the early days of my speaking career. I'd been a professional speaker for roughly 5-6 years. I was doing pretty well, but the thing I really took away that I think we can all learn from Vint Cerf, besides obviously his technical expertise, in terms of, in the context of being a speaker, is his humility. I don't know, man. If I invented the internet, I think I'd be kind of cocky. Like, I invented the internet. I mean, come on. Jeez, how do you hold back on that one? It changed the world, right? Email, Oh, by the way, I came up with email too. I mean, I think I'd be bragging about it. I'm not sure. I hope not, but I think I probably would be. So that being said, Vint Cerf did not. He was so humble. He kept backtracking and saying, I get too much credit, really. I'm just a scientist and I'm an engineer. And he said, I don't deserve the credit I'm getting here, although he clearly did. But just the humility of, someone that had done so many big things over his lifetime and had such a track record, and yet he was like the most humble speaker I think I've ever met, or certainly one of the most humble speakers I've ever met to this day, 20 years later. And so I think there's a lesson there for us all, because especially if you've been on the road as a speaker and you're doing book signings, you're doing photo shoots, and you're taking pictures of people and you're shaking hands, and they're rolling out the red carpet for you, and companies are putting you up in suites and fancy hotels, and you're kind of being paraded around like you're kind of a big deal. And that's sort of the business that we're in as speakers. That's just the way it works. It's easy to let it go to your head a little bit. It's easy to start thinking you're smarter than other people. It's easy to start thinking you're the smartest guy in the room and the smartest gal in the room, which is very dangerous to think that. Even if you are, it's dangerous to think that. I never have been personally, but I've known people that are, and it's dangerous. It can be a dangerous thing. I think the lesson here is stay humble. Stay humble, because you might be whoever you are, but the audience, you need to connect with the audience. You need to be humble and real, and that was a great lesson I learned from Vince Cerf. I've never forgotten over all the years that I've been traveling around the world giving speeches. And I think it's something really to consider. I was going to a bunch of conventions and speaking at a bunch of conventions over the late summer, and I think I probably worked with or saw somewhere around 100 speakers. And I think I did a post about this where I was just kind of shocked, because a lot of them were newer professional speakers, or the new generation that seems to be coming on since COVID, which is great. But wow, the peacocking, the bragging, the exaggerations of all kinds of things by these speakers. 'Cause I know a fair amount of these people, and they're throwing numbers out there that, and making exaggerated claims and that kind of thing. And that doesn't lead to anything good. You're just looking for a short-term ego boost and a short-term speaking career. It's not the way to go. And there's a lot of that out there right now. A lot of bravado, a lot of chest pumping, chest pounding, kind of a thing. And I think we have to avoid that as speakers. We have to be humble. We have to connect with our audience and remember that we're no different than anyone else. Just because we get treated like we're royalty, and we do, we're not royalty. We're just vendors. We're people doing a job, and we get paid to do the job, and then we go home. Whether we take pictures and sign books, or we're dragging our luggage through baggage claim, it's really all the same thing at the end of the day. We're just vendors. We're nobody really special. We just get treated like we are. So, just as a thought, stay humble, check your ego, and be like Vince Cerf.